It's week 4 of our series on the history of hell and the Christian faith. And today, we're talking about the second word translated as hell in the Bible, the word Hades. And trust me, the interchange of the words hell and Hades has led to loads of confusion for Bible readers over the last few centuries. And today's session might be challenging and eye-opening for you. And again, disclaimer, this series is about the history of hell and the Christian faith and is not about disproving the existence of hell or proving the existence of hell or anything like that. So if you're looking for a turn or burn kind of video, keep on scrolling because this series is about history. Oh yeah, my name's Ken. I'm a full-time Jesus-loving, non-traditional missionary that's been abroad for 5 years. I'm also a researcher and teacher that seriously digs history, especially ancient religious history. And I teach classes online too. You should check them out in my profile. So, let's dive deep into Hades.
Sorry, you mind running that by me again? I must have had a chunk of brimstone wedged in my ear.
Nope, not that Hades. This Hades. In prior videos, we discussed how the word hell in English Bibles was actually translated from 4 separate words. Words that each carried their own meaning and visuals in Jewish and early Christian culture. We talked about the use of Sheol in the Old Testament last week and how Sheol was translated as hell into English. But in the Old Testament, long before Sheol was translated as hell in English, Sheol was translated as Hades in Greek. And in the New Testament, Hades was later translated as hell 11 times in English in the 1611 King James, 10 times as hell and 1 time as grave. However, as we discussed in other videos, better translations of the Bible, and even the New King James Version, have now gone back to the original usage of the word Hades. In many of the most well-known mentions of hell that are in the New Testament, such as the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16, Jesus saying, "And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it," in Matthew 16:18. Jesus' warnings to Capernaum in Matthew 11:23 and Luke 10:15, Peter's first major evangelistic speech in Acts 2:27, and even the centuries later Apostles' Creed, which says Jesus descended into hell, are actually translated from the word Hades. And like the word Sheol in the Old Testament, Hades was where everyone went after death. When you kick the bucket, Hades is where you went. And it may have been where Jesus went after his crucifixion. And even the story of the thief on the cross in Luke 23, whom Jesus promises paradise, makes so much more sense when you understand the role of Hades, aka the unseen realm in the Jewish mind of 2,000 years ago. So, what's Hades? First, we need to explore a factoid that most folks in church are never taught, and that's the influence of Greek culture on Judaism during the intertestamental period and within early Christianity. Facts are that during the centuries immediately preceding Jesus, most Hebraic people didn't read, write, or even speak Hebrew anymore. If a commoner had any experience with Hebrew, it was usually on the most basic of levels. At the time of Jesus, Hebraic people spoke Aramaic, and outside of Judea, most Jews spoke Greek. And while Hebrew was spoken amongst the elite of Hebraic society, outside of them, most people simply didn't understand the language of the Torah. So when listening to Hebrew scriptures at temple, in Judea, folks would need readings translated to Aramaic. Everywhere else around the Mediterranean, Greek. And while you might go, I don't know, Ken, that sounds weird, just remember, for 1,000 years in Western Europe, the Bible was in Latin, which most Western Europeans didn't speak either. Kind of the same deal. Legend goes in the 3rd century BC, Pharaoh Ptolemy II ordered 72 Jewish translators, 6 each from the 12 tribes of Israel, to translate the Tanakh from Hebrew into Greek. Now there's a lot of doubt about the legitimacy of that legend, but what is known is that Greek translations of the Torah were widespread by the 2nd century BC. And by 132 BC, the remainder of the entirety of the Tanakh was common in Greek, and collectively this Greek Old Testament was called the Septuagint. And it was the Septuagint that was the most commonly read and used version of the scriptures at the time of Christ. This was the version of the Old Testament that people were familiar with and formed the basis of thought, theology, and cosmologies for early New Testament writers, church fathers, and also helped form the earliest Bible translations that we currently have. And in the Septuagint, when it came to translating the word Sheol, which we talked about in the last video as the Jewish underworld where all souls, righteous and unrighteous, went at death, the Greek writers translated that word as Hades in every single case, except 3, Job 24:19, Proverbs 23:14, and Ezekiel 32:21. Now, some of you may be familiar with Hades in Greek mythology. Hades was both the name of the ancient Greek god of the underworld and the name of the shadowy place underneath the earth the dead were sent. And in Greek mythology, at death, souls were ferried to Hades upon the river Styx. And upon arrival at the gates of Hades, guarded by the three-headed dog Cerberus, souls judged to have led good lives were allowed to drink from the river Lethe and would forget the bad parts of their life and then be taken to the Elysian fields, aka paradise. But if you led a bad life, or were known for offending the gods, you were taken to Tartarus in the depths of Hades and condemned to eternal torment. This is also where the Titans who warred with the Olympian gods were bound as punishment. Now, when it comes to the New Testament, a lot of this ancient Greek mythology was scrapped. But the ancient Israelite concept of Sheol, how it was a shadowy realm where both the souls of the unrighteous and righteous resided, bore many resemblances with Hades. And so in the minds of Greek writers, Sheol and Hades were interchangeable. Now remember, the Bible is a multivocal work. Its many writers had many different influences and ideas of what may lay beyond. But in general, it seems that Hades, in the intertestamental period and in the New Testament, was a place of two divisions, a place of blessing and punishment. And this is seen in Matthew 11, Matthew 16, Luke 10, Luke 16, and Acts 2. And remember, Hades is where everyone went. So if you went to the good place, sometimes referred to as the bosom of Abraham, that's where you would rest in peace with your ancestors. And some even believe the concept of paradise was present within Hades as well. Luke 23, thief on the cross, anyone? Bueller. But Hades wasn't just the good place. There was a bad part about the place too, a place of torment and maybe even flames, according to Jesus' parable of Lazarus and the rich man. Luke 16 even suggests that it was the angels who carry souls to where they were going in Hades, and that there's this massive chasm that separates the two places that is impossible to cross, but the tormented can see those enjoying rest. Now, some argue that this story in Luke 16 was just a parable that Jesus was using as a metaphor to talk about how earthly possessions and pleasures are of no benefit in the afterlife, and how Jesus was foreshadowing how some people wouldn't believe even if someone demonstrably came back from the dead. And others say Jesus was being very literal here. And honestly, how you interpret that, well, that's all going to depend on your interpretation and orthodoxy or denominational tradition. But what we do know, and is a fact, is that the idea of Hades being a place of peace and or punishment was widely understood by both Jewish hearers at that time and later Christians of the first centuries. And this is where it gets kind of complicated, and honestly, a lot depends on your religious tradition, how you interpret a major event in Christianity. And that is, what the heck happened to Jesus after the crucifixion, where he went, and what happened because of it. Because some interpret scriptures such as Matthew 12:40, Acts 2:24, Acts 2:31, Ephesians 4:9 through 10, Colossians 1:18, 1 Peter 3:18 and 19, and 1 Peter 4:6 as referring to Jesus descending into the earth to the dead, ministering to the dead. And all of this makes sense when you understand what Hades was to these cultures, that it was a place for the righteous and unrighteous. And according to Jesus himself in Revelation 1:17 through 18, he even comes slamming with the ultimate mic drop, "Do not be afraid, I am the first and the last and the living one. I was dead, and see, I am alive forever and ever, and I have the keys of death and of Hades." And let's not forget 1 Corinthians 15:55, which refers to the Septuagint version of Hosea 13:14. "I will deliver them out of the power of Hades, and I will redeem them from death. Where is thy penalty, O death? O Hades, where is thy sting?" But however and whatever you think about Hades, it's not something that is meant to last forever. Revelations 20:13 says death and Hades will give up its occupants, and Revelation 20:14 says Hades will eventually be thrown into a lake of fire, the second death. Whew, that's a lot of stuff. But we're not done with Hades. We'll come back to it much later in this series and talk about the impact of Hades on early church belief and the Apostles' Creed, but that's later. Because we're not done with the words translated as hell in the Bible. Next video, we're going to talk about another interesting word translated as hell, and that is Tartarus, which brought up a whole bunch of imagery for both Jews and Christians of the ancient world that's pretty lost on us today. So stick around, it's going to be a scorcher.